Okay, welcome back. Welcome back to the session. And I would like to have a look at the Slido that you hopefully answered to the question of, in the light of the global trends, which strategic choices should the EU make today? Please, could you please come back to the seats? Don't even... Oh, I can't see them in my screen here, but okay. So in the light of global trends, which strategic choices should the EU make today? Push democracy, DOSA. What is DOSA? Follow through on something, spiritual heritage, give up unanimity. Okay, so it's really about how we take our decisions. Nuclear energy question mark, we didn't discuss that today. Push democracy, and I think this is a really good opening for the next session. Invest in climate, follow through tourism, interesting. Action for all, I think this is an appeal to do something, not only speak. EU Defence Force. Okay, push democracy. I think this is a really good introduction for our next session, because it's about people power and about how to win back trust in democracy. And I would like to welcome our panelists and the moderator. So online we'll have Calypso Nikolaidis, who is the chair of global affairs at the School of Transnational Governance, European University Institute, and emeritus professor at the University of Oxford, who joins us online from Florence. And we'll have in the room Ricardo Borges de Castro, Associate Director and Head of the World Programme and European Policy Center. And we have, last but not least, Joseph Cyrilik, Director of the Strategic Futures Group of the National Intelligence Council in the United States. Thank you for having crossed the Atlantic to be here. And the moderator is an old friend of ESPAS, Shada Islam, who is director of the New Horizons project. She is visiting professor at the College of Europe and a senior advisor to the European Policy Center. So we'll discuss people power, how to win back trust in democracy, and please join me on the stage. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see some old friends here, and wonderful to see new faces as well. We've been doing this online for about 2.5 years, 3 years now, and it's really nice to be seeing you all in real life. So no need to explain to this august audience just what we mean by the title, how do we roll back authoritarianism and win back trust? But let me just give you a few introductory points. So living in today's world, today's challenging and at times for me heartbreaking world, we see that the decline of democracy is a global phenomenon. It's well documented and well tracked. And here in Europe, we live sometimes day to day with every national election, regional election, even municipal election. We catch our breath. Sometimes we heave a sigh of relief. Things are okay. And sometimes we really start to worry all over again. And I think it's no different, really, in the United States. But that's politics, and that's democracy, right? But is it really as simple as all that? In these times of digital fakes, deep fakes, and disinformation, is it just that simple? And when mainstream European politicians are often embracing right-wing views, is it really that simple? And when our young people are out in the streets, on weekend, on school days, clamoring for peace and clamoring for climate change, is it really that simple? So we're going to have 6 minutes now to talk about these issues, explore them a little further. And I'm going to jump right in. Calypso, you're joining us online. Nice to see you in virtually, if not in real life. So you, of course, Calypso, we've all read your work. You've written extensively on democracy, particularly, of course, in the European context. And you're currently chairing a high-level group on bolstering EU democracy for the Center for European Policy Studies and the German think tanks, SWP. Now, in an article you co-authored with our friend Richard Youngs earlier this year, you expressed a widely held view that democracy in the EU, as you put it, is not as robust as it should be. And you were saying that, to support democracy, we need to be robust at home, otherwise what credibility do we have outside? And so my question to you is, do you think democracy in the EU context in Europe is evolving, and what will it look like? I know I'm saying 20 years, but even in the next 5 years.
Well, hello, Shada and everyone. Apologies for joining from afar, but push democracy, we just heard, Shada. So I think that probably we can all start from the idea that democracy is not a magic wand, but it's at the heart of the answer to many of the questions that were asked today, throughout the day, and I followed with great interest. And yes, there's many different answers to this question. We did produce this high-level group report, The Radicality of Sunlight, it's called, arguing that you start with transparency and empowerment. But we've got the AFCO report, the Commission report on democratic resilience. Everybody's answering your question, Shada. But I think that today, what we want to ask is what the ESPA frame, what difference, how does it offer in this story? And I would base my prediction or my answer to your question in, first of all, arguing that the long term offers us a story, so we can lift our gaze above the radar, above the present, seeing that, yes, we are all observing what we could call the 3D, widespread distrust, disillusionment, division, dangerous attraction to wise men, even wars coming from that. But we are also actually witnessing a sort of tectonic competition between this trend and what we could call, much under the radar, the third democratic transformation. And that's maybe what Foresight calls weak signal, but they're all over the place. Yes, our young people walking in the street. Yes, Poland is back. Yes, revolutions that are democratic, even if they fail. But also all sorts of new ways of doing transnational, intergenerational democracy, translocal, new modes of democracy, digital crowdsourcing, citizen audit, and something where many of us are fascinated with, the rediscovery of civic lottery as the ancient, but with the new technology of the 21st century that can all amount to a kind of slowly emerging new democratic ecosystem around the world. And that's what we write about with Richard Youngs. So to me, the EU has to make this great strategic choice today, which is, what role does it want to play in this story? And the answer to your question then relies on this political agency from politicians, from citizens. Are we going to demonstrate the quality of democratic foresight rather than authoritarian foresight? Constance said it right at the beginning. The core of our soft power is to demonstrate this democracy. I call this citizen power Europe. But perhaps this needs to start from the realization that, when we've said this for a long time, that maybe there is a silver lining to the so-called European democratic deficit, that you can't throw the rascals out from all the EU institutions. But that instead, Europe is very well placed for democracy with foresight, because it has these long-term capacity to be guardian of the long term. This is why in the last few years, we've seen foresight units in every European institutions. And I hear echo Thomas in the previous panel. We are seeing the emergence of, and the adoption by the EU, starting with Kofi, of new democratic innovation, especially in the field of climate. There is democratic affinities between having to deal with the very difficult trade-offs that we heard several panels, including Heather's, discuss, and the need for citizens to appropriate these trade-offs across time, but also across social classes, countries, etc. Okay. So yes, there is a transformation angst around the world. But the best way to address it is what Europe is starting to do now, is to democratize and democratize foresight. And here I would just add two points here, Shada. One is that, and this is my punchline and the plea I'd like to make in this panel. One is about evolving our methodology for changing the long term, the way in which we think about the long term. This whole conference is about actionable recommendations. So can we enlarge the circle of collaborative foresight that we've been discussing all day to maximum inclusiveness, to mobilizing collective intelligence, yes, but beyond the circles that are represented in the room? Yes, to citizens, ordinary citizens taking part in all sorts of procedures that we can talk about, not just because we want their support and buy-in, but because they have very important things to say, but also enlarging the circle to citizens in enlargement countries.
Yeah.
There are many, and we talk about this in this report that you
I come back to the
advertise.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Calypso. I'm going to come back to the enlargement question because what you've said is very important to involve citizens there as well. And thank you for coming in and talking, giving us a little bit, at least me, some semblance of optimism about where we are in terms of our democracies. And you said there is a third democratic transition and a new democratic ecosystem that's developing. And you talked about inclusiveness, which of course is very, very dear to my heart. Just rules of the game, 3 to 4 minutes for each panelist, and then I really do want to go and get questions from the audience. Thank you, Calypso. Stay online, please, and we'll be back. So now to Joe, turning to you, Joe. So you published a report which said it was a positive scenario for the future of democracy in 2040, and it was entitled A Renaissance of Democracies, and you said, in 2040, you're looking ahead, the rising tide of economic growth, tech change, achievements will help us to ease societal divisions, and you said that we'd be able to compete with China and Russia, which have stifled innovation. Now, that report obviously was published a few years ago, I think last year, was it? And times move fast these days. 2 years ago? 2021, 2 years ago. So I was just thinking, if you were to write something today, would you have a different view?
Thank you, and thanks to ESPAS for having me and for taking me out of my comfort zone, because it's usually not my role to be the voice of optimism in any of these discussions. That said, we do see, looking to the future, a role for an optimistic scenario about democracy. Now, part of that is the whole point of doing scenarios is not just to warn against threats, but also to identify opportunities. So if you can't envision a positive scenario, how can you possibly work towards one? But that said, we do see a couple of trends that are relatively positive for democracy that could be incorporated into any future scenario. The first, and one thing that I think we forget often, given the press of business and the bias towards current action, is how much things can change in 20 years. A lot can change in 20 years, especially in terms of governance. If we just go back to the old adage, if I were to go back in time and visit the people of Berlin in 1900 and then talked about what the next century of governance in Germany would look like in 20-year increments, they would lock me up as a lunatic. To go from monarchy to liberal democracy to single-party dictatorship to both a liberal democracy and a single-party dictatorship simultaneously, to a unified democracy, to the centerpiece of a unified Europe. That's a lot of change in a century, and that's a lot of switchback back and forth in a period of 20 years. The second thing is we're in a period of profound change across all levels of society. And in that time of profound change, people as individuals and as societies are questioning everything. They are looking at institutions, they're looking at systems, they're looking at norms, they're looking at tradition and culture, and they're questioning whether all of those things have a place in the future and in current society and where they see the world going. So the first thing, one of the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic is for governance, one of the first things they're looking for is efficacy. early in the pandemic, we couched it in terms of whether it was democracies versus authoritarian regimes and which kind of system was doing better. When in reality, it was all about competency. There were competent dictatorships and competent democracies, and there were incompetent dictatorships and incompetent democracies. But while they're looking for efficacy, people, societies, groups are realizing their own new power. They have increased power, they have increased sovereignty, they demand agency, they demand the ability to have an influence on where their lives are going. So when you look at that dynamic, once you as a government are providing the goods and services that people demand, they're not going to be satisfied with that. They're going to want to have a say. And in that kind of environment, democracy definitely has an advantage, without a doubt. And the final thing to keep in mind is we talk a lot about currently the aggressiveness and the initiative that authoritarian regimes seem to have, as well as the power of populist and personalist political movements in the West, in democracies that sometimes lead to democratic backslidings in different states. An important thing to keep in mind is those actions are not being taken from a position of strength. They're fundamentally being taken from a position of weakness. There are structural factors at play in a lot of the West's key adversaries, those authoritarian regimes, that point to the fact that time is not on their side. And even for these populist and personalist movements in the West, they are certainly swimming against the current of history. They're fundamentally reactionary movements trying to stop or reverse the march of history. And in a lot of cases where people are going is not going to be arrested by a political movement. This is simply based on long-term trends, demographics, economics that are not really subject to change and not really subject to people's will or leaders' will to force solutions on.
Okay, Joe, thank you. Once again, of some optimism, cautious, but coming out there, saying that we are essentially intrinsically, structurally very, very solid and robust in our structures and our thinking and our ideas compared to Russia and China. Actually, Ricardo and I have just come back from China, so we can have a discussion on that. Let me turn to you, Ricardo, in fact. And we've talked about different forms of democracy, and you've made a point in a paper that you wrote for European Policy Center on anticipatory democracy, and you say it may be the key for Europe to remain strong and open in a more competitive and fast-paced world. Just explain to us what your thinking is.
Thank you, Shada, for the question, and thank you also for the invitation. This is like a family reunion, so it's really great to see so many friends. So I think the idea, and it goes a little bit, I will be also positive and optimistic. I think elections are about renewal, are about change. And as it was already said today, 2024 is going to be an electoral year. It's going to be a year of elections on steroids, basically. So there will be voting a little bit everywhere. And this is a moment, indeed, for renewal, and I think it should be seen that way, a moment to also to include the younger people that you were speaking earlier. But I think at the institutional level, at the government level, I think what democracy needs to do, and that's why I did write that paper on anticipatory democracy, what I observed throughout my experience working with politicians and working with foresighters is that these two kinds don't get along very well, or they have a hard time dealing with one another. And so my point was more than actually make the case that is done often and often and often, that politicians are short-sighted, that they only look at the short term, that they don't look at the long term, was actually to tell foresighters we do need to look at the short term. The decisions are made in the present. So the role, actually, the adaptation process that needs to happen, it's more on our side to try to come to the needs and constraints of elected politicians. Because for me, in this discussion, what is key, I mean, foresight is very, very important. But more important than foresight to me is democracy. are we able to sustain our democratic systems in such a competitive and fast-paced world? So this was, for me, was my concern. And the observation was that any time that I would speak with, and sometimes myself, frustrated that my ideas, my advice would not reach there, because necessarily political leaders in this building, across the street, in the European Parliament, they are dealing with a crisis of the moment. But for us to be able to help them, we do need to factor into our analysis, into the studies that we do, into the reports that we prepare, these electoral cycles, and we know, I mean, what are the trends? The trends are of more fragmentation of political systems, I mean, in Europe and elsewhere, sometimes our societies are deeply polarized. And then, of course, you mentioned in your introduction also foreign interference, deep fakes, disinformation. All of this is in a sense, there is, I mean, the conditions for destabilization, for interference are there. So I often say, and I'll end here, I know that this is the zinger, but it's nevertheless very true. If democracy cannot be faster, because necessarily we take time to make decisions, we deliberate, we discuss, we have different opinions, and that's very important. If we can't be faster, then democracy needs to be smarter. And being smarter means being able to anticipate events and to be able to try even to prevent them in a way that we are also able to respond to what are the expectations of citizens. Because if we look at the past 3 years, a pandemic, Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, and Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, and the consequences that came out of that, I mean, we were not prepared. We were not prepared to respond to that. So this is really, in my perspective, trying to upgrade our systems, and a lot has been done over I'm saying it was my last point, I'm continuing. A lot has been done in the past few years, and we can talk about that, but we need to do much more.
Right, so trying to inject a sense of today into our vision for tomorrow, being realistic about the challenges we face today in terms of what our publics want, what our young people want, and making sure that somehow we can converge the two together. So, yeah, interesting point to make. Thank you, Ricardo. Calypso, to come back to you, when I cut you off, you were starting to talk about enlargement. And of course, very important politically that we do so, we give the promises, and then we start working towards the actual membership of these countries. But it's going to obviously make a dramatic change in terms of how we do our procedures, our decision-making, and all the rest of it, but also some of the countries wanting to join have volatile, to put it mildly, volatile democratic standards. So how are we going to, in our foresight, how are we going to take those factors into account? And same for you, Ricardo, actually.
Yeah, clearly a challenge for these countries and a challenge for us, the existing member states. And the first response probably has to be that we have to be consistent. We are always accused by the rest of the world, and including our neighbors, of double standards, etc. And this is why we responded 2 years ago by creating these national rule of law and democracy reports that are about the actual member states. So whatever we do, we need to develop methodologies to be able to identify democratic pathologies wherever we look, inside the EU or in the new member states, candidates. But there, of course, we have long talked about the lack of bite of the Copenhagen criteria, the fact that at the end of the day, once there's enlargement, democracy can be lost. So I would recommend, and we recommended with my colleagues in this high-level group, that there should be requirements for better track records, data collection of how we monitor the risks of state capture in these countries, formal and informal, the politicization of the civil service, the nepotism, the budgetary capture, special interest, corruption, kleptocracy, all of these are monitored by civil society actors in these countries. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, beyond the very technical method we use, how we can continue to empower them, while at the same time giving a better sense that they are also citizens of democratic progress in the EU itself. So one of the proposals that we make in this report is that for every council presidency, we have hopefully a citizen assembly in the parliament of the member state with the new presidency, which would include citizens from the candidate countries and which would be very visible in the public sphere of these countries. Now, all of this is the theory. What you actually do in a country at war like Ukraine is a question that, you know, we shouldn't forget, because it's easy to say now, yes, Ukraine, and it's not that easy, but we have said it now, you're a candidate. But what will it mean for working with democracy under the language of emergency, the language of war? I think this will be one of the biggest questions of the next year or two or three.
Thank you, Calypso. And it's true also. I mean, we've had citizens' assemblies and citizens' consultation in the past, but if I remember correctly, that really hasn't made an impact on our decision-making, or any of the input has just been sort of nicely said, thank you very much, and put perhaps on a back burner. So I think that's something to remember as well. I'm going to go to Ricardo first to get his ideas on the same thing, and then I'm going to come to you, Joe, if you allow, and then turn to you for your questions and short comments. So, Ricardo.
I mean, I agree with what Calypso has said. I would look at this and the potential impact on our democratic systems from a different standpoint. I mean, we are talking in the conference that it's building Europe's future. Enlargement is the EU enlargement, bringing other countries, for those that are not so familiar with our debates, bringing other countries into the EU as members is going to be the transformative and strategic project of the next decade. This is probably the issue that I'll be working more on for the next 10 years, besides combating Russia's aggression and this containment of Russia that was discussed this morning. So I think policy-wise, this is what I'm going to be dealing with. But our democracies as well. The transformative nature of this process and the implications that it will have in the cake that we are all eating, that the 27 are eating. Either we increase the cake and we bring more to the table, or we're going to have a problem. And I think that a problem that stems, I also believe, from lack of, or could stem from lack of leadership, of being honest, that there are trade-offs to this process. And if at the moment bringing Ukraine, which I believe it is a geopolitical and a moral, I rarely use the word moral in this type of discussions, but I would say that it's a geopolitical and a moral imperative to bring Ukraine into the EU. This will have consequences on agricultural policy, on budget, on cohesion, on everything, every single issue that we can think of. There will be an impact. And so I would also make, if I can take, and I finish here, take the suggestion to ask ESPAS to next conference next year should be dedicated to enlargement and how to make enlargement happen and what are be the consequences and how the EU will look like in 2034. Because I think we also should think about political cycles at the EU level. So we are either talking about 2029 or we are talking about 2034.
I'm going to have a private conversation with you on why morality is a wrong word to use.
Okay.
I think it's a very, very important word to use.
I use ethics more. I think morals, we can get in a really, really tough discussion if we talk about my morals and your morals. So,
Okay,
anyway.
well, let's have a private conversation. I think it's a very important topic. Ethics, morality, humanity, compassion, empathy are not words that should not be used in
But those are
geopolitics.
different things. Those are different things.
But they're important. Okay, Joe, to come to you now. I mean, in your report, obviously, the technology element was mentioned as well. And when we're talking about, the sort of blows that democracy is getting these days, the bad reputation democracies are getting these days, how can technology be used more effectively to sort of give us, more of a stronger vantage point, a stronger position?
Yeah, when we're talking about democracy and technology, it's also always important to keep in mind that the technology itself has no morality. It is not intrinsically good. It is not intrinsically bad. It all comes down to how people will use it and what the motivations are for that use. And what we've discovered is the truly disruptive applications of technology are seldom what they were intended for. Technology is designed by a commercial entity or a government to solve a particular problem, to put to a particular use, but often the more disruptive event is when it is taken by another group and used in a completely different manner. And that's certainly evident in social, digital, and social media. When I can remember when these platforms first existed, they were going to bring us all together and they were going to make the world safe for democracy. It didn't quite turn out that way. And we've examined quite a bit, gone round and round in circles, trying to assess why it is that something that was designed to help democracy actively undermined it. We don't have a great solution. One of the things that has fascinated me, talking to tech companies and talking to consultants in private business, is don't look at the technology and don't look at the intended application of that technology. Look at the business plan that that company came up with to monetize that technology. And often that will tell you how its effect will play out. So for social media, regardless of what the rhetoric is and regardless of what companies and groups say its purpose is, if you look at the business model for most of these companies, it is based on advertising. Advertising is based on getting eyeballs to look at ads, and that is prompted by playing off of human emotion, which is best expressed through anger and worry and causing discomfort. So that is, when you look at how these technologies have been monetized, it is playing off the most base instincts of people. So looking to the future, it's important when we see the application of technology to figure out how it's being used and how that, looking at the second and third order effects of how that's going to be. So there are going to be technologies that we're only starting to discern now that have been invented for probably the best of reasons, that will be applied for the worst of reasons, and consequently, there are probably technologies out there that are being utilized by dictatorships and meant to be weapons and meant to be destructive tools that can be turned against evil and used for good purposes. So we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about deep fakes, and these things for misinformation and disinformation, but the ability for those same technologies to be used to do things like information inoculation. You can't, once a story is out there, you can't backpedal. You can't tell people it's wrong. You can't, what's called myth bust. So once the lie is told, the lie is true. And there's not a lot of things you can do about it. Right. But if you can get ahead of it, if you can tell people that they're going to be lied to and to be aware of it and to be prepared for it, that usually has a much greater effect. And things like artificial intelligence are hopefully going to help us with that fight.
Right. Of course, literacy is very important, but some people would argue that technology has given voice to the voiceless and a face to the faceless. So I think there are bright sides to the issue as well, and we can talk about that as well. So my pleasure now to open the floor to questions and comments from yourselves. I've just come in here now. I wasn't here this morning, so maybe if I don't know you, just introduce yourselves. And I think there are microphones that are available. So I'm very happy to take the floor. I already have a gentleman here on the right side. If you put up your hand a bit, could you put up your hand a bit higher? Yes. Thank you.
I'm Maurizio Salvi from the European Commission. Just a question about anticipatory democracy. Are you referring to anticipatory policy design in political terms, than to have a sort of political strategy that is projected to the long-term consequences? Or are you referring to anticipatory democratic approach in which you reflect people's expectations and then as a result of participatory democracy, let's say? What is your main target?
It's more the first. It's more the first.
But then it's not linked to democracy.
Please.
It's policy design.
No. But the idea, and the reason I can explain. The reason why I use this term is that the conventional term that is used in foresight terms, and I think Sheila is here, Sheila has been working on this for many, many years, is anticipatory governance. My argument is that anticipatory governance, anyone in the world can do. Anticipatory democracy, which is what our systems need to do, is much more difficult because of this contested space of elections, political parties. Pavel is not here, Pavel Shibor. He used to have this expression that I like a lot, which is the infrastructure of politics today. It's very, very complex. And so doing or governing in democracy in an anticipatory way means that all the systems that we have been putting in place at the moment, for example, at the European Commission, need to be upgraded. So my expectation is that as we move forward, as the EU moves forward with this and governments, is that, and Katharina Hedberg is also here. Katharina used to bring foresight and futures discussions to the ministers' weekly meeting once a month in Sweden, for example. This is the type of activities that I'm talking about. And so, of course, I believe that, and we have discussed this already, bringing the perspectives because to a certain extent, foresight continues to be a very elitist activity. And it's true that foresight, as it was said in the previous panel, I think in many of other panels, it needs to be democratized. It needs to be more participatory. But at the level that, if you read the article, I look at this from three perspectives. The global perspective, so what kind of alliances that the EU needs to have to preserve democracy or to build up this anticipatory system. Then having strong public administrations, and we need, I think, if the trend that we are observing of fragmentation and polarization continues, then we're going to need to have strong public administrations that are able to run things as politics, naturally will continue, and there will be changes in this. And third element is society. Futures literacy that Shada was mentioning too on digital literacy, but futures literacy should also be something that should be brought down to society and even to the press, to the media, because the media, for example, do not understand very often what a scenario is. So I think that these three elements would be fundamental to upgrade this system. I gave it the name anticipatory democracy. Maybe you call it something different, but that's the general idea.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the explanation. Ricardo, you talked about the media, and obviously I've been in the media and I still write op-eds. We often blame the media for not understanding, but I think, policymakers and politicians don't often explain things very well either and engage in a kind of double talk, which makes it very difficult to actually understand what's being said. But we also talked about networks, and I've been at a number of conferences recently where the problem of communication has been identified as being a very important problem. So I think when we're talking foresight and we want people to be participating, understanding the language becomes very important as well. So I'm more than happy to now take more questions before turning to the panelists for other comments. Yes, I have to swivel, but I'm swiveling. Yes, please.
Hi, Josh Polcher from the OECD Public Governance Directorate. I've in the past made the analogy that strategic foresight practitioners are a bit like dentists who like to perform major surgery, but that's not what the people who come into our offices are used to, and it can be quite a daunting experience when the reality for most people is that dentistry is 3 minutes of brushing your teeth a day. Likewise, we've heard some very ambitious, and that's a laudable thing, ideas about the future of democracy and how we can and should upgrade our systems. But what can each of us do in the next 3 minutes, and what can we recommend to the people we advise and provide research to do in the next 3 minutes to help improve things?
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep that question for the last one because I always like to turn to the future. futures in the lab. But thank you very much for that question. Is there, if there isn't another question, I'll go to, yes, I do see a hand at the back. I'm sorry, the light is shining right in my eyes, but I see 2 hands go up there, so, and 3. So let's go from the back. Yes, the lady over there, please.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Yasmina Byrne, Chief Foresight and Policy in UNICEF. We are preparing our own global trends report, and we have Youth Foresight Fellow networks, and they chose to talk about democracy. We offered them to choose any topic they wanted to talk about, and they wanted to talk about democracy. And on the one hand, we see a lot of disillusionment among young people with democracy and a loss of faith. On the other hand, we see a lot of hope for intergenerational equity, for inclusion, for a just world, for sustainability, and so on. So how do we actually work with young people to not disappoint them in their hope and quest for democracy? Because we are going to see fewer and fewer young people being inclined to vote or to participate in democratic processes if we don't do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you for that very important question, because next year, for the first time, 4 or 5 European countries, including my country, Belgium, 16-year-olds will be voting. And I think I'm hoping, crossing fingers, that that brings more energy into the democratic processes and also democracy itself. So thank you very much for that question. Put it on my agenda. The second, somebody there as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon Noonan of the European Parliament Research Service. Is there a place somewhere for European Union's strong support for citizens' dialogues in the sense of urban dialogues where different citizens from different communities speak to each other rather than citizens speaking to the authorities? I would see this as a possible strategy with both short and longer term dividends to address the rise of anti-democratic movements, which is certainly something we have an interest in trying to head off a tipping point towards the success of anti-democratic movements in Europe on the scale that they're enjoying in America.
Thank you for that. Noted, please.
Thank you very much. Pia Ankiele from Director General for Education, Culture and Youth and Sports as well. New responsibilities. I can be brief because my question was partly covered already by one of the recent questioners. But Shada, you mentioned indeed new younger voters are going to come to the fore to vote in the European elections next year. Ricardo was mentioning we have to make democracy smarter, and indeed many of these young voters are finding themselves a large part of their time in cyberspace. So digital is at the heart of all of this. You've mentioned technology. But how do we make democracy smarter than when it comes to digital? That's my question.
Thank you, Pia. This morning I was at this feminist foreign policy conversations, and my colleagues there would have a very simple answer to that: bring more women into it. So thank you very much for that. I don't totally agree with that. I think you need authentic women leaders. So that's that. Anyone from this side that I have? Thank you. Where? Oh, please. Yes. The light is shining in my eyes.
Sheila Ranis from Ohio State, and I am the Sheila that Ricardo was just describing. I have to ask you why you think that anticipatory governance is so simple, because no one does it. So it'll make anticipatory democracy, which I do agree is a level above it, that much more difficult, at least in the United States. And I think we desperately need to get there.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? If not, I'm going to come back to the panel. And I'm going to ask you to pick and choose the questions you want to answer. But do come back to the question that was put forward there about the recommendations that you would make. So I'm going to turn to you, Calypso, first. Please.
Yes, I completely agree that when we speak about democracy, we tend to be obsessed with the vertical connection between citizens in groups or individually and policymakers. And yes, that's important. But this is the benchmark our evaluation. We ask, and Shada, you asked, in a way, isn't there a risk because if run improperly, we can lead these citizens, assemblies, audit, etc., can lead to the same kind of cynicism and distrust that we are fighting in the first place because of disappointed expectation. And that is very true. So there is a lot of thinking to be done about the sociology of power and why is there resistance to sharing this power, as it were, with citizens. But also it is important in Europe to encourage and create the capacity for people to speak horizontally. This is why the Conference on the Future of Europe, the Commission panels, the next panels that will also be organized with the European Parliament, we're working on it at EUI, are so important because they bring citizens across countries and to enter a space of mutual recognition, to think of how they can provide public goods themselves. We see more and more of that. So this is a horizontal vision of democracy and that complements the vertical. This is very important. And so if you ask what you can do in the next 3 minutes, I would say open Google and Google our democratic odyssey with our consortium of friends, where we are trying to advocate and show how you can do a standing citizen assembly that would be permanent in the EU and provide that spirit of horizontality and include Gen Z Europe much more thoroughly. Shada, yes, 16-year-old, why not younger? Indeed, to take part in these debates. I've been advocating for a Gen Z Europe that looks more like young people and operates like they do. And this brings me to the last point on the digital world. That's their world. We spoke a lot in an earlier panel about the dark side of AI. But now Joe was very rightly talking about what tech can do. And when we do that, let's look at the young people, for instance, in Taiwan, who've developed the police platform using AI so that people not only can aggregate their decision from the grassroots, but situate themselves and situate their preference in their community. And that's part for me of an agenda of, yes, looking at what young democratic activists do, but also looking at what they do globally and reversing the democratic gaze so that Europeans learn to be given lessons by these other countries, by these countries around the world, rather than simply thinking that they're the ones who do democratic promotion.
Absolutely.
So this is a global agenda.
Thank you, Calypso. I have to start being more rigorous about the timing. I've just said, they just tell me it's only 5 minutes left. I thought no, right, exactly. That's a mistake, right? Yes, exactly. That's what I thought. Yes, I thought there was still 10 past 5. I've done this before, so I was a bit surprised. Thank you very much, Calypso, for those. Do you have a final recommendation to make? Because I do have that extra minute to give you now. Or you can come back to it if you like. Yeah. Okay, Joe.
All right. So there were a couple of questions about young people, and there was one question in the back about urban, rural identity. I'm going to wrap all this up in the question of identity politics. And we're used to thinking about identity politics in rather negative terms. It motivates and mobilizes populist movements, and it can be taken advantage of. But I'm going to approach populist or identity politics from a positive angle. Older generations, when they're asked their identity, tend to have very simplistic responses. It might be their nationality, it might be their religion, it might be their career, it could be a whole host of things, their political party. But a lot of identity becomes subsumed in that one moniker or that one name. And if you think about traditional political parties, they tend to fit a lot under their tent because to gain power, they need to appeal to a broader audience. To appeal to a more broader audience, they need to have a pretty wide swath of people they appeal to. Younger people have seem to have a much more complex definition of identity, one that's much more fluid, that allows them to hold multiple identities, some of which might be contradictory, in their heads at the same time and be okay with that. And I think that could be tremendously positive for democracy, and kind of give it a fresh look, because no longer are we using identity politics to divide people, but you're actually using identity politics to bring people together, to allow that people can cooperate on certain issues, be opposed to each other on other issues. It doesn't mean they're going to be part of the same. Somehow we gained 5 minutes.
I know. It's the magic of this place. Right.
So that's the power of foresight. We actually bought ourselves some
Exactly. But it's really interesting, Joe. You've just mentioned and defined intersectionality without actually using the word.
Yeah, I'm not an academic, so.
Okay, but you've just absolutely very well defined intersectionality, and it's not just young people, I have to say. But thank you very much for your intervention. Ricardo.
I mean, so many different and interesting points that were made. Shall I go to the recommendation at the end? Okay, at the end. So, Shayla, I think the reason why I say that anticipatory democracy might be more difficult to do than anticipatory governance is that I confess my assumption and my bias, that I tend to look at anticipatory governance as something that is top-down, whereas anticipatory democracy, there's an element of bottom-up as well, of participation, because there's many more players. So my argument was more that, for example, China and Russia, I mean, I'm not saying that they are good planners or that they are able to do, but if they make a decision, a long-term decision, for example, China 2025, the moment that decision was made, all efforts and all policies were put into that direction. There was no discussion, or maybe there was internal discussion, we don't know, but this was the direction that was given. You know, maybe a lot of people would have opinions about it. These were not expressed. So what I was trying to convey is that anticipatory governance, to a certain extent, is very much, I see it as a technical, even sort of elite process that does not, or that is less inclusive than anticipatory democracy. So that was the difference, but I'm sure that you could show me otherwise, because I think this is really the purpose of having this term out there. I think going to Pia, a good friend and a former boss as well. It's great to see you, Pia. I think listen, I think I'm not a technologist, I'm not an expert on technology, but I would look at how technology is being used in so many different professions. We were discussing with a few colleagues earlier to give personal examples. One of my nephews is, or that we should not use many personal examples in conferences, but anyway, I'm going to use this one. And one of my nephews is what is called an ethical hacker. So he hacks into systems. He's paid by the government and by a company, by a private company, to hack into systems. So he's actively using technology. And why does he do that? Because he was always a gamer. So it is like a game. So I don't know, what I'm trying to convey is the following. So mutatis mutandis, if we imagine democracy as a game, if we put democracy to younger generations as a game, as a competitive sort of approach to who's going to win this competition, who's the best player to win, I'm not saying, I mean, this is also not an attempt to make it
Ricardo, you'll have to start
basic, yeah.
wrapping up.
But what I would say, let's look at other examples where technology has been used to actually motivate younger people to actually participate,
right,
and in a positive in a positive way.
And now you've got the microphone, so the final word, the recommendation you'd give
to Josh. Yeah, I mean, I would say I think over the years that I've been dealing with strategic foresight, we know that there are three roles, essential roles on foresight. There's the producers, there's those that are doing this. There are the consumers, which is all of us. And then there's a third one, which is the translators. And this is where I would put my money on. Okay. Put the money into translating foresight into policy making. Do what Vice President Šefčovič was doing this morning. Make it actionable. Make things better. You know, use this to make things better and to actually turn them into action. If foresight is not a call to action, it has failed.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Calypso.
Yeah, I'll amplify my former recommendation because what Ricardo now just has described as anticipatory democracy, we can call simply democracy with foresight. And that means that the foresight, the grand exercises that we're all familiar with, need to happen everywhere. including in school. So I was kidding you, Shada, a bit about the age. 5, 6 years old can do foresight at school. What will happen if we change our menu or if we put the classrooms in a different way? And this is really in the mindset, in the ethos of appealing to people's and young people's imaginaries when we talk about democracy. So it's not this technical stuff, but it has consequences. And young people care about not so much Europe. Our generation may regret it, but they care about the global way above and the local way below. So how do we speak to their imaginary so to show Europe can do something about that? And my proposal to end on the recommendation is that is for a permanent citizen assembly in the EU that would be tasked with this exercise in democratic foresight.
Thank you. Very, very important what you said, to get to the children before they get infected and polluted by the adults. Get to them when they're early and they're still innocent and know morality and show empathy. Thank you for that. Joe.
All right, so I'm going to take the question very literally, and what can we do in the next 3 minutes? So when we break up after the next session, find someone in the audience who is your political nemesis, who is your adversary, who you don't agree with at all on anything, and talk to them and make a human connection, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together and no one gets out alive. So, this is a very non-geostrategic answer, which is, but really just go talk to more people, get diverse opinions, talk to people you would never talk to. This is a little tough. I'm looking around the room. Gender, we're fairly balanced. Ethnicity, education, we're probably not very balanced at all, but we'll go with it.
Tell me about it. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm not going to divulge any secrets. I write op-eds, and all these ideas then filter into my op-eds. So read my op-eds is all I can say. But very, very much thank you to ESPAS. Thank you to everyone for the fascinating conversation. Let's give Calypso, Ricardo, and Joe a hand, and let's talk to each other in whatever break we have now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shada, Joseph, Ricardo, and Calypso for this last session. And yeah, we have now come towards nearly the end. We have now a little wrap-up session by two representatives of the ESPAS Young Talent Network, which is set up to engage young professionals across the ESPAS organization to use foresight for policy making. And I would really like to warmly welcome Julia Fioravanti and Sarah Nihus, who will now try to share the key takeaways of the session. Thank you.